You are listening to Accents, a radio show for literature, art, and culture. I'm your host, Katerina Stoikova, and my guest is poet Bianca Spriggs. Hi, Bianca, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing, Katya?
Doing great. I miss seeing you, I miss hugging you,
I
and I
know.
miss hearing your work. So here we are trying to remedy that.
We made it happen. It took a pandemic to make it happen, but here we are.
Let me introduce you to our listeners with a few biographical notes.
Okay.
Bianca Lynne Spriggs is an award-winning writer and multidisciplinary artist from Kentucky. She really has done anything and everything in the arts. An assistant professor of English at Ohio University, Bianca is the author of 5 collections of poems, including The Galaxy is a Dance Floor from Argos Books 2016 and Call Her by Her Name, Northwestern University Press in 2016. What I'm holding right now is Black
hmm
Mermaid.
Yeah, that came out a couple years ago. So I've been very blessed by the poetry fairies, the poetry gods, with having a collection come out pretty regularly for the last 10 years. I've got one coming out, next spring as well in 2021.
Well, tell us about that one.
So it's called We're Still Big Banging, and it's a kind of sequel to The Galaxy is a Dance Floor. But it also, I had 2 books come out in 2016. I had The Galaxy is a Dance Floor and Call Her by Her Name, which is, I call it a double rainbow because that very rarely happens. And there were very different themes going on. Call Her by Her Name was more a celebration of women's voices from across canons and history, and even just the women next door. It was a very woman-centric book. And then The Galaxy is a Dance Floor was much more general. Is literally more universal. It was exploring matters of the heart through the lens of the cosmos and the natural world. And so We're Still Big Banging sort of takes its cue from both of those. And so I'm blending stories from ancient literature, master teachers, gurus, and also cosmic knowledge and science, and just throwing them all in there together in the gumbo. And so We're Still Big Banging is the result. So it's sort of an answer to the questions that I was asking in those books a few years ago.
So tell us about your interest in mythology.
I grew up, a lot of people know this by now, at least from Kentucky. I grew up in the church. My mom's a minister. And so I grew up hearing very old stories all the time, and my interest changed towards the more fantastical. The older I got, I was selecting stories from Grimm's fairy tales, or the Little Red Riding Hood stuff. And then I started hearing these ancient Greek myths by middle school. And so a lot of that, as well as randomly Star Trek and sci-fi, all of that started to really form in me at a very tender age while I was defenseless. And so I ended up being a history major in college, and my love of those old stories has never gone anywhere. And now as a scholar, I know that my job is to figure out a way to, it's like pattern recognition. We're still telling versions of those narratives today, and being able to point back to different cultures, different civilizations, and say, we got that from them. It's it's a nice little superpower, to have. And how can we expand the conversation in the 21st century? So I feel kind of like a literary archaeologist in a lot of ways.
I love it. And I heard that we model our lives after our favorite childhood tale. Is that true for you? Because it is true for me.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I think I'm still always trying to write some version of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I think that was like my favorite book growing up, and I read it, and I read it again last summer, that whole series. And so opening a wardrobe door into this mystical land, you can't do better than that. So yeah,
Lucky, very lucky that you had that one.
Yeah. That was my favorite. That was the one that I remember. I mean, we had Roald Dahl growing up and Shel Silverstein, but in terms of getting a whole story, a whole adventure that you could just relive over and over and over again, um, certainly on some level, that's the story that I'm still trying to tell for sure.
Oh, I know that you have prepared a few poems for us. Would you like to read
Yeah.
them?
Yeah, so I brought four poems with me. The first three, uh, I dug these up while doing research for I was commissioned by Berea College to write an origin story about Medusa. So for the last few years, I've been doing a lot of really heavy study in ancient Greek literature. And so the first three poems are more situated within the pantheon. And then I have a final poem that is Kentucky related. So we'll start with the first one, which is called Pandora's Conundrum. And when I was talking earlier about this idea of how can we revisit some of these antiquated stories and bring them into the 21st century, I was trying to find a core theme for the play that divided. When I write bigger works, I start off with a poem because that helps me sort of socio-emotionally analyze it. And so I was thinking about Pandora's story and how, these characters in ancient literature are always lampooned, or they're always accused of doing something wrong and bad. And we all know the story of Pandora's jar or Pandora's box and how she released all the world's evils. And so I decided to investigate that or interrogate that and perhaps posit the question in this poem. Perhaps Zeus knew what he was doing by giving her the box. So this is called Pandora's Conundrum. It was never about opening the box. That part, simple. Boxes are designed to be opened. Consider that Zeus knew what he was doing. He made it just for her. Alabaster scented with balsam, the lure of something sacred. That part was easy, the opening. How could she not? Would any of us keep such a box closed, a gift from a god? Today, folks suppose what she let go of was spectacle, was vice, was impurity. But without nefariousness, where would heroes come from? What are stories if not for the overcoming? What if the box was a symptom even Zeus could not reckon with? What if, tired of everyone's malaise, Zeus gave the box not out of cruelty, but out of desperation, the giving a god's cry for help? What if the only mistake Zeus had made with men was making them too much like himself, easily distracted? What if what he needed was entropy, the cacophony that only a woman knows how to midwife into the world? Besides, what else were men doing with their time? Much too early, men would have peeked without the puzzle he fit inside the box. It was always hers to open. Men needed something to keep them occupied, something to talk about, so they'd forget for the moment about the fallibility of gods, obsess instead about the fallibility of women. No, the decision was never about what to do with the lid. That part was easy. The difficulty arose upon when to shut it and what to keep in. So, so yeah, just really kind of trying to figure out, like, maybe we don't know the whole story, with Epimetheus and Prometheus and, these gods trying to get back at each other. Maybe it's not everything that we think we know. So, the next poem, it's a little shorter, but it goes into something similar. It has to do with the legend, of course, of Orpheus and Eurydice, where, Orpheus ended up leaving Eurydice in the underworld because he looked back. He didn't trust that she was there. And there's this really interesting, in writing this collection, I've become a little bit of a I don't understand all of it, but I've become a little bit of an ancient math nerd. So like all these different issues, like the Zeno's problem, Achilles, race in a tortoise, and just kind of trying to figure out what these guys are actually talking about. It's part math and it's part philosophy. And so there's something called the mountain climbing problem. And if you Google mountain climbing problem, there's a little graphic that shows two people on other sides of a mountain range trying to meet. If they agree to meet at the same point, at the same place, the same time, but they start on opposite sides of the mountain, the suggestion is for them to stay to meet at the same time. One of them is going to have to go down, one's going to have to go backwards. And so the mountain climbing problem is a mathematical problem where to advance, sometimes you have to retreat, And so I was like, wow, what if, the underworld was full of all these mountains, and the reason why Orpheus couldn't see her, he was looking back for her, is essentially because he wasn't sure what side of the mountain she was on. So this is called the mountain climbing problem. We forget what the world looks like below ground. There are levels down here too. Your eyes will never adapt to such pitch, never see there's more than caverns whittled out by water and limestone and time and gravity. There are mountains here, half of another planet, still rotting somewhere inside. And just like up top, when two people first agree to meet from opposite sides at the highest peak, they must also agree to climb at the same height the entire time, not knowing if when one has to go backwards or downhill, the other is still all in. What I mean to say is, he couldn't hear Eurydice before he turned to look for her, because she was never behind him at all. She was on the other side. And for my last little trip down ancient Greek literature lane, I've got a poem about Dionysus. And he's very interesting to me. He's called the twice-born god. They used to call him the child eater, someone who delighted in tearing kids apart and then putting them back together. And the way he was born, having Zeus rescue him from his mother's womb when he accidentally killed her with a lightning bolt, and then sewing him into his thigh and then bringing him to Mount Olympus. Dionysus was a very tortured deity. And so his story in particular, how he never really felt comfortable around the other gods. And so he surrounded himself with these maenads and was just wild, had these depths of despair to him, really the first emo character that a lot of us had ever met in literature, really fascinated by him. And so this is called You Can't Rationalize with an Irrational Person, or Why the Maenads Run. Dionysus, twice-born god, sewn into his father's electric thigh, an outsider even at home. No wonder he grew up so fast. No wonder his flair for the dramatic. He got it honest. Dionysus, the child eater, Dionysus, patron of fennel and pine, of madness and misfits, the flicker of shadow at the edge of an eye, Dionysus, accursed bearer of blessed wine. He won't say why, but in between harvests, he sometimes searches for the maenad that slipped out of her ecstasy once, but kept on dancing away from him in the gloam, barefoot, hips sparkling. Because they stayed, he sets the rest of them to looking for her too, gives them bear flesh to eat, makes them impervious to bramble and sword, just to bring her back, just to say he could. That's why those girls run and bleed and run and won't stop until they die or their limbs snap off like thorns, whichever happens first, in case you'd ever wanted to know. So, the last poem that I'll share with your listeners is a Kentucky-based story, and it revolves around a python that is in the Louisville Zoo. I'm not sure if Thelma is still there or not, but I read about her from an article in the Smithsonian.com in this is an article written in 2014. And Thelma bore 6 live snakes without a mate. And this is something that is just very rare in nature. It's an event called parthenogenesis. I think that's it. Let me make sure that I'm pronouncing that correctly. Parthenogenesis. Okay. And so I was fascinated by that and was like, okay, well, what would, for me, poems are ways to ask questions. So I really wanted to know, why would a snake feel comfortable enough to make more of herself without a partner? And so this begins with a quote from that article. It's called An Issue of Blood. 6 babies born to an 11-year-old reticulated python at the Louisville Zoo have only one parent. They are the result of a virgin birth. The python, 200-pound, 20-foot-long Thelma, had never been near a male snake during her 4-year tenure at the zoo. Call it some kind of cosmic angel's share or some kind of karmic devil's cut. Whatever the case, 6 live baby snakes out of 61 eggs ain't bad odds when you consider not a single one had a daddy. Maybe it was the limestone in her drinking water. Maybe it was the 40 pounds of chicken they fed her. Most pythons in the wild wouldn't be eating so good. Maybe it's because she didn't have far to move for months, so she spent her time wrapped like an Ouroboros around and around all those leather eggs. Maybe it was because she stopped fighting being kept. At her age, there were advantages to this gig, like enough room to stretch without bumping into her own tail, and so parthenogenesis. Maybe 4 years was all she needed to get enough clapback going down her spine to break a record. What's good enough for a Komodo dragon named Flora or a hammerhead in Nebraska is good enough for a Burmese python in Kentucky named Thelma. Or maybe, for the first time in her life, she actually wanted to come first, win at something. Anything where her name would have to be said in whispers. I can't believe she pulled that off. And as Thelma watched those little squiggly wet bodies nudge up out of the soupy center of their eggs, I bet the first thing she thought was, damn, I'm good. And the second, they'll have to remember me now. They'll have to. They'll have to. And that's that poem. So that was my final poem, and I reading it now, I'm also remembering thinking about what it's been like for me, kind of in the confines in Ohio, having been here for almost 3 years now, and all of the work that I've been able to produce, it's a little bit of a writer's paradise. I don't have as many distractions here. It's very quiet. And rural Ohio, I have a steady paycheck that I didn't have back in Kentucky, and just the flexibility, the luxury of time and space, it does wonders for creative people when we're not so stressed out, So that was definitely slightly autobiographical.
That answers my question, how are you feeling in Ohio? Sounds like you have a lot going on for you, and obviously your work is showing for that. These were wonderful. These are so alive. I admire your curiosity. I think you've been gifted with this tremendous curiosity, and then the follow through of research.
Oh yeah. I can't not know. It's like an itch you can't scratch. I have to. I mean, there are questions that literally keep me up at night, and so until I find out something, sometimes for days, for absolute days, months, I'm still thinking about Sophia the robot, and she shows up in this collection too a little bit, but it's really I have a very insatiable curiosity for sure. It's a problem.
And how do you keep yourself from burning out?
Not only do I have several projects going on at any given time, but they're in different mediums. So when I'm not writing, I know my writing seasons are typically spring and fall. I tend to stall out writing in the summer and winter. So that's when I'm making more visual art. I'm sewing, I'm doing clay, I'm embroidering. making quilts, drawing. And so sometimes those works inform the written work. So We're Still Big Banging is going to have watercolor illustrations in it. And so I'll be doing those this summer, instead of writing. And there are other ways. So for the play, I'll be creating little scenes, because who knows when that's gonna, because of the quarantine, who knows when school's gonna be back in session
Right.
and things like that. So now I'll be creating little scenes and models, and I have the luxury now to be able to say, okay, well, what would this actually look like? Or maybe we could do an audio play, or, so to really think
Right.
about different ways to disseminate the work now that we have. I mean, I just got an invitation today to do a bourbon poetry online festival. It's going to be on Zoom, it's like,
Great.
it's wild. Or I have my own YouTube channel, and so I'm interviewing other artists. So that always helps stokes the fire as well, because art is a conversation. And you know we all have something to contribute, but sometimes you don't know what you have to say until you hear someone else talk about something that they're interested in, and that sends you down some other hole. So I recently had, Joseph Nichols. Recently
Right.
he's been helping me with research. I said, hey, go look up some stuff on Anubis for me, because I just really get stuck with Anubis, and he came back with like some beautiful stories I would have never thought to look up or look into. And so just having that kind of exchange with other artists, you don't always have to produce. Sometimes you can be an audience member or a fan or receptive, and just let it work its magic on you as well. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Bianca. It's been
Thank you.
pleasure to catch up and to hear your new
Yeah.
work.
Thank
And
you.
I hope we do that again when
Yes,
your new book
please.
comes out. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Anytime. Anytime I can.
Yeah. Have a wonderful rest of the week, Bianca.
All right. You too, Katerina. Take care, everyone.